Late at night, a train rolls through the outskirts of a forgotten town. It never stops, and its whistle sounds like a scream. When curious passengers board it, they're never seen again. When Claire's brother disappeared after chasing the sound of the whistle, she vowed to find him, even if it meant stepping aboard the train herself. Claire grew up in Hollow Creek, a town so small and remote that most people didn't even know it existed. It was a place of tall, swaying trees, foggy hills, and endless quiet nights. Everyone in Hollow Creek grew up hearing the same chilling stories about the midnight train. It was said to roll through the valley once every few years, though no one ever saw it arrive or depart. Those who claimed to hear its whistle described it as the sound of metal grinding on bone, a piercing scream that echoed through the hills and sent shivers crawling up their spines. Most people in town dismissed the stories as urban legends. After all, the train tracks leading out of Hollow Creek hadn't been used in decades. They were overgrown with weeds, rusted, and buried beneath years of neglect. Yet every so often, someone claimed they heard it. Claire never believed in the midnight train until the night her younger brother, Ethan, disappeared. It was a stormy evening, the kind where rain lashed against windows like frantic fingers. Ethan had gone out to meet his friends, promising he'd be back by 9. When the clock struck midnight and he still wasn't home, Claire began to worry. She tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Her parents assumed he was being a typical teenager and had lost track of time. But Claire couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. Something was wrong. The next morning, Hollow Creek was buzzing with rumors. Ethan's friends claimed he'd left their hangout early, saying he wanted to check out something cool near the old train depot. That was the last time anyone saw him. Claire went to the depot herself, hoping to find some trace of her brother. The place was in ruins. The wooden platform had rotted away. The windows of the station were shattered and graffiti covered the walls. The air was damp and heavy, and a thick fog clung to the ground, muffling every sound. That's when she found Ethan's jacket, soaked from the rain, lying in the dirt by the tracks. He would never have left without it, especially not in the cold. Next to the jacket were faint footprints, leading down the tracks and into the forest. Claire's heart pounded as she followed them, calling Ethan's name. The footprints stopped abruptly about a mile from the station. The tracks here were more intact, the metal rails gleaming faintly despite their age. Claire stood there, staring at the empty stretch of forest ahead, when she heard it, a low, mournful whistle cutting through the silence. It sounded distant, almost like a memory, but it made her blood run cold. Over the next few days, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the train was calling to her. She began hearing the whistle at odd hours, even when no one else did. At first, she thought she was losing her mind, but then she remembered the stories, the ones about people who went searching for the midnight train and never returned. Desperate for answers, Claire started digging through the town's history. She spent hours in the library, combing through old newspapers and records. That's when she discovered something chilling. The train wasn't just a ghost story. In the late 1800s, Hollow Creek had been a bustling logging town. The train line was the lifeblood of the community, transporting lumber and supplies in and out of the valley. But in 1892, a terrible accident occurred. A passenger train traveling through the valley derailed on a foggy night, plunging into a ravine. Over 50 people were killed. Their bodies never recovered. According to the records, the train was buried under tons of debris, deemed irretrievable. But the local legends claimed otherwise. Survivors reported hearing screams and whispers in the woods near the crash site for weeks afterward. Some said they saw figures wandering the forest, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Others swore the train whistle could still be heard on foggy nights, as if the train were searching for passengers to replace the ones it lost. Claire couldn't ignore the parallels. Could Ethan have somehow boarded the midnight train? The thought was absurd, but it was the only explanation that fit. She decided there was only one way to find out. On the third night after Ethan's disappearance, Claire returned to the tracks. She packed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a small backpack with essentials. The air was cold and damp, and a thick mist blanketed the ground. She followed the tracks to the spot where the footprints had ended, her heart pounding with every step. The whistle came again, louder this time, and accompanied by a faint rumble beneath her feet. Claire's breath caught in her throat as a light appeared in the distance, cutting through the fog. It was impossible, but there it was, a train, its sleek black engine gleaming like polished obsidian, rolling silently toward her. The train came to a stop a few yards away, its doors sliding open with a soft hiss. Inside, the carriages were dimly lit, and shadows flitted across the windows. Claire hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run, but then she thought of Ethan. If he was on that train, she couldn't abandon him. Taking a deep breath, she stepped aboard. The interior of the train was eerily pristine, as if it had been frozen in time. The seats were upholstered in rich red velvet, and gas lamps cast flickering light across the polished wood paneling. But the air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As the doors closed behind her, the train jolted to life. Claire moved down the aisle, calling Ethan's name. The further she went, the stranger things became. Passengers sat in the seats, their faces turned toward the windows. But when Claire got closer, she realized they weren't passengers at all. They were bodies, pale, lifeless bodies, their eyes wide open and staring into nothingness. Claire's heart raced as she reached the end of the car. She pushed through the door into the next carriage and the next, each one more warped and unsettling than the last. Shadows danced on the walls and whispers filled the air, growing louder with every step. Finally, she found him. Ethan was slumped in a seat near the back of the train, his face ashen and his eyes vacant. He didn't respond when she called his name or shook his shoulder. Desperate, Claire tried to drag him to his feet, but it was like he was rooted in place. That's when she heard it, a voice low and cold, speaking directly into her ear. "You shouldn't have come." Claire turned, but no one was there. The lights in the train flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to move, stretching and twisting toward her. She had to get out. Grabbing Ethan by the arm, she pulled with all her strength. Somehow, he finally moved, staggering to his feet like a puppet on strings. Together, they stumbled through the train, the whispers growing into a deafening roar. When they reached the door, Claire threw it open and jumped, pulling Ethan with her. They hit the ground hard, rolling into the foggy forest. Behind them, the train roared past, its whistle piercing the night. When Claire looked back, the train was gone, as if it had never been there. Ethan was alive, but he never spoke of what he saw on the train. To this day, Claire hears the whistle sometimes, calling her back. She knows better than to answer. In the months that followed their escape, Claire tried everything to help Ethan recover. Doctors ran tests but found nothing wrong with him physically. His vitals were normal, his brain scans clear, but he was no longer the same person. He barely spoke, his once bright personality replaced by a hollow, faraway stare. At night, Claire often woke to find him standing by the window, staring into the dark woods behind their house. When she asked what he was looking at, his only response was, "They're coming." The strange occurrences didn't stop there. Lights in the house flickered unpredictably, shadows moved where no one was standing, and the sound of the train whistle became more frequent. It wasn't just Claire who noticed it anymore. Her parents, neighbors, and even the local sheriff began to report hearing the mournful cry of the midnight train. Claire's sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares. In them, she was back on the train, surrounded by faceless passengers whose mouths moved in silent screams. At the end of each dream, the shadowy figure she had felt on the train would appear, stepping closer and closer, its hollow eyes boring into hers. She always woke drenched in sweat, Ethan's whisper echoing in her mind, "They're coming." Desperate for answers, Claire sought out the town historian, an elderly man named Harold Greaves. Harold had lived in Hollow Creek his entire life, and was known for his obsession with local lore. When Claire told him about the midnight train, his face grew pale, and he immediately locked the door of his study. "You shouldn't have gone looking for it," Harold said, his voice trembling. "That train isn't just a ghost. It's a collector. A collector of what?" Claire asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Souls," Harold replied. "It searches for people to replace the ones it lost in the wreck. The ones who bored it become part of it, trapped forever. But escaping," he hesitated, rubbing his hands together nervously. "Escaping comes with a price. It doesn't like to let go." Claire's blood ran cold. "What kind of price?" Harold didn't answer directly. Instead, he handed her an old, faded book. The cover was cracked leather, the pages brittle with age. Inside were detailed accounts of people who had encountered the midnight train over the past century. None of them had happy endings. Those who escaped, if they were ever seen again, were haunted by the train for the rest of their lives. "It will come back for him," Harold said gravely, pointing at a sketch of the train in the book. "And for anyone who interfered. You opened the door, Claire. Now it knows who you are." Claire left the historian's house more terrified than ever. As she walked back to the foggy streets, she felt eyes on her, though no one else was around. That night, the train whistle sounded louder than ever, shaking the windows of the house. Ethan's condition worsened. He started talking in his sleep, muttering fragments of strange phrases. The conductor is watching. The passengers wait. The train never stops. He began drawing the same image over and over. The train, its dark silhouette cutting through a foggy forest. Then, one night, he was gone. Claire woke to find his bed empty, his window wide open. Panic seized her as she realized he had left on foot, his muddy tracks leading into the woods. She grabbed a flashlight and ran after him, her heart hammering in her chest. The fog was thicker than ever, muffling her calls and distorting the trees around her. She found him at the tracks, standing perfectly still. The light of her flashlight caught his face, and she gasped. His eyes were no longer his own. They were black, endless voids that reflected nothing. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, the familiar whistle sounded, this time deafeningly close. Claire turned to see the train materializing out of the fog, its headlights blazing like twin suns. The doors opened, and this time Claire saw him. The conductor stepped out, tall and gaunt, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. His skeletal hand extended toward Ethan. "No!" Claire screamed, grabbing her brother's arm, but it was like trying to pull a stone. Ethan didn't budge. The conductor turned toward her, and for the first time, she saw his face, or rather, the lack of one. His features were blurred, shifting like smoke, yet his hollow eyes burned into hers. "You brought him back," the conductor said, his voice a guttural rasp that reverberated in her skull. "He belongs to us." "No, he doesn't," Claire shouted, tears streaming down her face. The conductor tilted his head. "Then take his place." The world seemed to freeze. Claire's heart thundered in her chest as she realized what he was offering. Ethan's life or hers. She didn't hesitate. "Take me," she said. The conductor's lips curled into what might have been a smile. He reached for her, his cold, bony fingers closing around her wrist. The train's doors yawned open, revealing endless darkness. Before she stepped aboard, Claire turned to Ethan. For the first time in weeks, his eyes were normal, wide with shock and horror. "No!" he screamed, reaching for her, but the conductor waved a hand, and the force pulled Claire forward, separating them. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was Ethan collapsing on the ground, screaming her name. Inside, the train was alive. Shadows writhed along the walls, and whispers surrounded her, growing louder with each step. Claire felt herself being pulled deeper into the carriages, her body heavy and her mind foggy. She knew she had made the ultimate sacrifice, but she didn't regret it. The train roared to life, hurtling through the endless fog. Claire sat down in one of the seats, her head resting against the cold window. The whispers were no longer frightening. They felt familiar, almost comforting. As the train disappeared into the night, Ethan lay on the tracks, sobbing. He would never see his sister again, but he knew one thing for certain. The midnight train wasn't done. One day, it would return for him, and when it did, there would be no escape.